喂，好的，现场的各位老师、同学，然后还有我们线上的各位老师、同学和朋友们啊，我们今天下午的这个讲座我们就开始了这个我们今天有幸请到法国巴黎第8大学Yves Sintomer 教授来给我们做一场讲座。我们讲座的语言呢是英语所以我们后面的这个语言都是英语哈。Okay, so it's our honor, it's our great honor to have Professor Yves Sintomer with us to give us a talk on Europe, on the contemporary transformations in European politics, society, and the kind of a mood in Europe, and especially about the right-wing populist movement in Europe. So I will give a brief introduction to Professor Yves Sintomer and also our two guests. I'm sorry that Professor Cui Ziyuan has not arrived. I told him yesterday. I think probably he's on his way, but let's see. So Professor Yves Sintomer is an honorary senior fellow at the Institut Universitaire de France, one of the French most prestigious institutions, and professor of political science at Paris 8 University. He is affiliated professor at Basque Country, Spain, Neuchâtel, Lausanne, Switzerland universities, and he has been invited in many universities around the world, including Tsinghua, Harvard, Yale, University College London, and so on. He has been a deputy. I think he used to be a deputy director of Mark Bloch Center Berlin, and his most recent books include Participatory Budgeting in Europe, Democracy and Public Governance, Between Radical and Deliberative Democracy, and Random Selections in Politics from Athens to Contemporary Experiments. This is published recently in Cambridge University Press. And Sortition and Democracy, Practices, Tools, Theories. And I should mention that Professor Sintomer's book about sortition has recently been translated into Chinese and published in Peking University Press. So Professor Sintomer has been a long friend of ours. Have been we have very close, relationship in terms of exchange and communications. So Professor Sintomer will speak for like 1 hour or so, and we will leave the floor open for questions and discussions. And also, we are very honored to have two guests with us, Professor Zhang Yongle from the Institute of Area Studies at PKU and also Law School, and also Professor Cui Ziyuan from Tsinghua University. Hopefully, Professor Cui Ziyuan will arrive shortly. Okay, so let's warmly welcome Professor Sintomer. Give us this talk.
Well, thanks a lot, Demin. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be here and to have this possibility to. From Europe and arriving in China, you have the feeling that it's cool here. When it's more complicated in Europe. So there was a real shock when a couple of months ago the Vice President of the US told all European leaders the enemy is within. It's not Russia, it's within. And the enemy is a woke culture. And with this very strong intervention in European politics and the distance the US have taken towards the European mainstream leaders and the defense of the far-right populists in Europe, this is really a very big term, a very big shift. I mean, perhaps you can think about the split between Soviet Union and China in the 60s, something like this, especially in a period where the far-right populism is in the rise in Europe. So I will have three basic claims. The first is that Vance is right, but the danger, the enemy, is much more the right-wing populism than the so-called woke culture. The second claim will be that there is an international of the far right, but its expression in Europe is quite specific. It's not the same than in the US. And the third, we just began. And my third claim would be that the enemy within is also the status quo, the liberal status quo. The system is broken nearly in Europe. And if we don't change, then the future will be very difficult. So I first will briefly remember the far right at international level, then try to describe precisely what the far right populism in Europe is, and then try to give a couple of underlying factors to explain the decline of the Western political system and the rise of far right populism. So, first of all, the far right at international level, mostly in the West. We really have a far right international with meetings where all these peoples meet, not Putin and Modi, but a lot of leaders of the far right in the West. In the West, which means not only Europe and the US, but also Latin America, meet together and try to elaborate together a common strategy. You can see that they are all men. Putin and Modi, to some extent, have the same political ideas, but for geopolitical reasons, do not take part in these meetings. In Europe, we have a lot of leaders who are part, at least at ideological level, of this far-right international. You can see from the left to the right, Meloni, the Prime Minister of Italy, Orban, the Prime Minister or President of Hungary, Duda, who is a strongman of the Polish far-right, Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader in France, and so on and so forth. So a lot of leaders. A difference is that you find some women, which is not the case in the US or at least at this level. Still, to speak about the far right is to speak about quite different social constituencies. You have, to some extent, the far right in ties, the capitalists. I mean, they are very strong in the US, they are very strong in Brazil, for example, and it is an important constituency, potentially, of the far right at international level. Then you have the far right in uniform, the military and security forces, which in some countries, like the US and like Brazil, or in a lot of countries in Latin America, play also a very big role. Then you have the far right in sweat shirts, the high-tech CIO, Elon Musk, who used to be a Democrat and who is now the main partisan of Donald Trump. Then you have the far right in blue jeans, the traditional working class, but also a growing number of self-entrepreneurs, like the Uber workers. Now you find more Uber-style workers in a lot of countries than the traditional industrial working class. They want to be entrepreneurs, they don't like the state, and they are different from the traditional blue collars. And then you have the far right in rags, the Lumpenproletariat, those who are really poor, which, especially in countries like Latin America, are an important constituency. So, this is more the social level. For the ideological level, I think that at international level, we have four main ideological trends, constituencies who are very active in the far right. First, the Christian fundamentalists. You probably know that in all America, both North America and South America, the new Protestant churches, the evangelical, are on the rise at demographic level and are, for most of them, oriented towards the far right. It is an important constituency. The second constituency is those who are libertarians. I don't know whether you know the word here or the concept here, but they are not liberals, they are libertarians. Liberals in the US are for individual freedom, but also for the welfare state, say, when libertarians are against the state, both at economic and cultural level. Elon Musk is a good example, but you have a lot of libertarians among the self-entrepreneurs. You have the national populists, which will be the core of my discussion later on Europe. And you have some fascist trends, but which are not a majority in the US, but they could become a majority, which are important in Latin America, and who are a minority in Europe. These very different persons, classes, and ideologies are united on, I guess, at least 6 common imaginaries. The first one is a very sectarian nationalism against migrants, Islam, multicultural society. A second dimension is to claim national sovereignty against globalism outside, against the rule of law, the checks and balances and constitutionalism inside. And so they put the imaginary of what Orban, the leader of the far right in Hungary, has called illiberal democracy. They also push the idea that the people has to rebel against the elite, the mainstream political elite, but also against the underserving poor, the poor who do not deserve to be helped by the state. Very often, these persons who are targeted like this are migrants. Fourth imaginary, security, order, increasing military and security repression against what is considered as laxism, against the so-called woke culture, multiculturalism, diversity, equity, inclusion, which is the target at the moment of the Trump administration, against what the philosopher gender trouble, against post-colonial politics, and the idea that people's welfare is more important than ecology and the green transition. We could say that these are topics which are shared by all the far right in the West. But there are topics on which they are divided. First, there are those who argue in favor of a strong state, and those who are libertarian and who argue against the state. They are also divided in geopolitical terms. Some are more pro-Russians, some are pro-Americans, and some are for both. There is also a difference. All say that the so-called woke culture is bad, but some want to go back to the traditional family, and others think that some kind of feminism is good, a Western kind of feminism against the gender trouble and Islam. And some are opposed to modernity, and some pretend to propose an alternative view of modernity. So it was a very general introduction before to switch to the European far right. What is it exactly? What is exactly the far right in Europe we are speaking about? When you consider the far right in Europe and you compare it to the US or Latin America, you have common differences, which are important. The capitalists, for example, 10 years ago, were not in favor of the far right. Only a few were in favor of the far right, but there is a growing trend for a fraction of the big capital to join the far right. So it remains limited, but it's on the rise. In uniform, well, in Europe too, the guys in uniforms tend to be in favor of the far right, but the guys in uniform are much more numerous in the US or even more in Latin America than in Europe. So in Europe, they are oriented towards this political direction, but it's not a big constituency. The high-tech CIO, well, again, it's a rising tendency, but still, they are not that important in Europe compared to the US. So the key constituency in Europe is the traditional working class, on the one hand, especially the white working class, and the self-entrepreneurs, the Uber workers, which join also the classical petite bourgeoisie, the small peasants, the shop, those who have a shop, and so on and so forth. So this is a core constituency who vote for the far right in Europe. And the lumpen proletariat is not that important in Europe due to the welfare state, and is in favor of the far right but not mobilized. So, to summarize, in Europe you have much less the big capitalists and the guys in uniforms and the high tech. And for the far right, the biggest challenge is to unify the blue jeans guys and the ties guys, to win a part, at least, of the big capitalism, and to be much more powerful with this. In France, for example, Bolloré, who is the most important boss in the media, has now completely joined the French far right. And this shift is very important for the public opinion. Another specificity, if you look at the US, in blue, Democrats, or Harris, in red, Trump has made much more in counties, in places which are backward, which are not the modern economy, and the most dynamic parts of the US have voted against Trump. In Brazil, it's the opposite. In Brazil, the most modern parts of Brazil are voting for the far right, and the less developed parts have voted for the left, for the President Lula. In Europe, it's more like the US. The parts, let's take France, for example, the parts of the countries which more vote for the far right are the parts where the economy is not going that well, is not the economy of the high-tech economy, the economy of the 21st century. It's more places in which you have problems. And if you look at the social constituency, the far right makes much more among non-educated persons, persons with a lower income, and blue collars. This is the case in most of European countries, not in all, and we'll see this shortly. The constituency at ideological levels. What about the Christian fundamentalists? The biggest difference between Europe and the US and Latin America is that we don't have the Protestant fundamentalists, the evangelical. It's a very small minority in Europe. So the equivalent are the fundamentalist Catholics, who play more or less the same role, but they are less numerous in France compared to the US. And religion is going down in Europe, so that it is not enough for any party to rely only on far-right Catholics. Anti-state libertarians are important in some countries. What is important is that a lot of Uber-like workers are also libertarian. And until now, the left addresses mainly the working class which has a formal employment and the civil servants, and has difficulties to speak to the Uber workers. The national populists, it is the core of those who vote for the far right. I will come back on this. And fascists, we have some fascists, but it's not a majority. And so in average, when you compare the far right in Europe and in the US, it's less religious, it's less radical. Trump is more right-wing than, I would say, 80 or perhaps 90% of far-right leaders in Europe. And another difference is that it's not a mass political movement. The Make America Great Again movement is a real social movement, a mass movement. We don't have this in Europe, with a few exceptions. There is a debate, I want to quote it quickly, but in the European left there is a debate, is it fascist or is it not fascist? If you take the classical ideologies of fascism, I would say that it is not fascist. They don't want a dictatorship. They want an authoritarian, illiberal democracy, which is something different. The importance of virilism, the affirmation of male dominance, is not that important. And in the historical fascism, there was the idea that the modernity could be a fascist modernity. There was an alternative modernity opposed to the liberal one and the communist one. And in the case of the far right in Europe now, it's much more a reactionary view, a nostalgic view of the good past. America was great in the past, Europe was great in the past. The social criteria, the big bourgeoisie at the time being has not taken part massively for the far right. And you don't have the mass political parties and mass social movements, which were a strong characteristic of fascism in history. You don't have mob violence in the streets in Europe. You do have it in Brazil, you do have it in India, but you don't have it in Europe, with a few exceptions. And this was also a crucial part of fascism. So I would say that at the moment, it's not a fascist movement, although a lot of left-wing intellectuals speak about fascism. There are fascist tendencies, but it's more right-wing populism. One characteristic also in Europe is that the far right needs alliances for different reasons. The first is that the EU is a weak federal state or a confederal state. So if you want to have the power in Europe, it's very difficult if you don't make alliances. And you have a powerful checks and balances systems. But also, in most European countries, elections are made with the party list proportional system, which means that in order to govern, you have to have 50% of the people. And it means also that you have not only two parties, like in the US or in England, but you have a lot of parties. And you have to make alliances in most cases in order to be in the government. So the electoral system, which is quite different from the Anglo-American one, makes alliances necessary. And this is also a good reason for not being as radical as Trump can be. But, and this is a crucial dimension, the traditional right is going more right-wing in the last 2 decades. So the perspective is that an alliance between the traditional right, which will be more right-wing, and the far right is the objective of most of the far-right parties, and this is a credible objective. And in the meantime, the narrative of the far-right is increasingly influential. And for example, in my career as an old professor now, I never had such pressure in my academic life, especially on the Palestine-Israeli conflict, but also about Islam and the multicultural society. There is a very big pressure which pushes academics and universities to a self-censorship. So what is going on in the US at the moment is not as hard in Europe, but the direction is the same. So now I introduced it, and I want to give a panoramic view of the far right in Europe now. You see in the colors the 7 countries in which the far right takes part in the government, either as a majority, the main partner, or the minor partner. So it's a minority at the moment, but it would be possible that in 3 years, say, Spain, Portugal, France, Poland, Austria, Romania will be also will have a government in which the far right will take part. It's not sure, but there is a good possibility that at least part of these countries will also have a right-wing, far right-wing government. So it's not a majority, but it's growing, it's increasing, and the tendency is towards more powerful far right. In the European elections last year, the far right made more or less 1/4 of the votes and 1/4 of the seats. But the far right is divided in 3 groups. So above you have the conservatives, the classical right, which is the most important parliamentary group. Then you have the social democrats. Then in red you have the most important far right group, Patriots for Europe, where you have the French National Rally, the Fidesz in Hungary, and one of the parties which is in the government in Italy, the Lega. Basically, it's nationalists, populists for a strong welfare state. It's not anti-Russian. It's ambivalent about the EU, but it's not pro-NATO. The second far right group, European conservatives and reformists, it is mostly in Italy with Meloni, the Italian prime minister, and the former government in Poland. This is a Catholic conservative far right, which is pro-NATO, or which used to be pro-NATO. No, NATO is in a mess, but traditionally it was strongly pro-NATO. Then you have the liberals, the Greens, the left, and the last one, basically it's the German far right, the AfD, which is not Catholic at all, which is pro-Russian, and which used to be not pro-American, but now with Trump and Musk it is pro-American, but which is strongly anti-EU. So the first, Patriots for Europe, the most important, are ambivalent towards the EU, the second is pro-EU, and the third is anti-EU. I also put, you will have this, I don't describe the different results, but basically you have far-right parties who get 10% of the vote and others who get 40% of the vote. So it's quite contrasted as a result. What are the varieties of far-right populism in Europe? It differs from one country to the other. Take Germany, for example. What is striking is that in blue you have the result of the far right in Germany. And this is exactly the border of the former East Germany. It is why my colleagues in Germany called Phantomgrenzen, phantom frontiers, borders, excuse me. It's only in Berlin, in Leipzig, and Erfurt that the left, or in big cities, that the left has a majority in Germany. In dark, it's the Christian Democrats, and Social Democrats are in red, and Greens in green. So first thing, you have differences in respect to the past, which are important for the present. You can see this in Germany. You have to note that East Germany is one of the less religious countries in Europe, perhaps the country which is less religious in Europe. So it's not a Christian far right, not at all. The far right in Germany attracts more men. Men vote much more for the far right than women, but the leader of the far right party, Alice Weidel, is a lesbian openly, is married to an immigrant with a Swiss nationality. So it means that the conception of the family is not the conception of the family that is shared by a lot of Trump voters in the US. It's a kind of conservative feminism. We have to defend the rights of women against Muslims who are attacking it, and we have to defend the rights of homosexuals against Muslims. What we don't defend is trans persons. And more or less, the AfD, the German far right, is stronger in the deprived parts of Germany. Take Poland. Again, you have a kind of phantom border. In the 15 years ago, the far right is in blue, the conservative are in green, in orange, and this was a border of the former German Empire. And after the war, the Second World War, Poland lost the eastern part to Ukraine and Russia, and get the western part on Germany. And those who were in the part which was given to Russia and Ukraine were displaced to the west. And this place is a place where people vote for a traditional right, and the place which was Polish all the time vote for the far right. So we have also to think about this when we speak about the far right. But in Poland, like in Germany, like in France, the parts of these are the last elections in Poland, and you see that here in blue, the far right, are the most deprived part of the country, except in the middle, Varsovia, which is the richest part of the country, and the western part is more either liberal or conservative. And again, the main explanation for the far right in Europe is the economy is not going well. But this is not the case in Poland. Poland is a country which has seen the most important economic development in Europe, and it is a country which is the more EU, in favor of the EU. So it's complicated. Italy is an exception in Europe, because in Italy, the far right, it's more in blue, is strong in the richest part of the country. So it's more like, say, Brazil than the US. And in addition, those who have a master degree vote the same for the right, the center, or the left. There are not such differences between people who are educated or not, people who are and people who are living in cities can vote also for the right wing. In France, Le Pen is conservative, but again, she's probably lesbian. At least she lives with a woman. She had a lot of gay people around her, so she's not for the traditional family, but she's against trans people. and a part of the national rally is more conservative than the leader. She's for a strong state, a strong welfare state, and the working class constituency is the biggest constituency. Different, much different from the constituency in Italy, and more similar to the constituency in Germany or Poland. In Austria, the far right is on the left. You see that in the big cities, it's not that influential. In the small city, it's more influential, and in the countrysides, it's very influential. So the same pattern, the parts of the countries which are less developed vote more for the far right. But again, this is complicated. Take Netherlands and Hungary. At social level, they have the same working class constituency, less educated constituency. So the social classes who vote for the far right in Hungary and Netherlands are the same, more or less. But in the Netherlands, it's not Christian, it's the leader is a gay man, is against Islam because Islam will reduce the rights of gay people. When in Hungary, it's much more Catholic and it's much more conservative at cultural level. So you can have the same social constituencies and different cultural ideologies. So if you want to make a typology, you have two poles in the far right in Europe. One pole, which is the majority, which relies more on the traditional working class and Uber workers. This is for France, Poland, Hungary, Germany, and so on. And you have one pole, Italy especially, where you have a strong presence of the middle class and elites. And this makes a difference between. And you have at cultural levels those who are very conservative for the family, who are, say, traditional fundamentalist Christians, mostly Catholics in Europe. And you have one pole which is more modern, which is in favor of some kind of conservative feminism. You have different geopolitical strategies, those who are pro-US, those who are pro-Russian, those no with Trump who are pro-both. You have tendencies which are opposed to the EU and tendencies which are strongly in favor of the EU. And there is a strong dilemma with Trump because Trump, with tariffs, makes the things difficult for Europe, even more for China, but we are more dependent than China about the US. So it is difficult for the part of the far right which was pro-American, Meloni in Italy, to have a position now. So if you put all this, not all together, but the cultural differences and the social differences together, you see on the first line predominantly social constituency, and the second line a mixed constituency. And the columns, the first one is ambivalent about modernity, and the second line is against modernity. So you have, for example, the National Rally in France, who is ambivalent towards modernity because of this conservative feminism, but who used to have a social constituency who tries to gain more attraction within the elite. The German AfD is here too, and Netherlands party again. But in Belgium, for example, the parties are much more a more mixed social constituencies and this ambivalent relation with modernity. In the box, strongly Catholic conservatives with a social constituency which is working class. You can find the Polish, the Austrian, the Swiss, the Fidesz in Hungary. And in the box, Catholic conservative and mixed constituency, you can find the Italian far right, the Spanish far right, and a small far right movement in France around a leader called Zemmour. So we can speak of the far right in Europe in an homogeneous fashion. We have to understand the differences, to understand the different alliances and the future. So now I want to switch to the factors which can explain the rise of the far right in Europe. I think that the most important factors, it's not the only one. Think about this shadow border in Germany or Poland. You have a lot of factors which are different. But if you want to take a global view, I think that the decay of our economy and our social system and of our political system is the main factor for the rise of the far right in Europe. Let me say a word on the notion of populism, which is in the title of my speech, and which is used in quite a messy mode in the West. Take, for example, the New York Times, but it would be exactly the same now. European populism in the age of Trump. It was the first term of Trump. And you put different parties of the left and of the right, which are called populists, and which share only the critique of the mainstream politics. Otherwise, they are opposed on nearly everything. So we can wonder whether this is interesting to put so different political parties in the same box. I think that the problems with the mainstream narrative on populism, both in the academy and in the politics and in the media, is that it is defined only negatively. To some extent, those who are called populists are the opposite of the liberals. This is the opposite of liberal democracy. They are not pluralist. They don't respect the constitution. They are not rational. All features which are supposed to be the features of the mainstream elite. I think that we need a more neutral definition of populism in order to make it sociologically and politically more accurate, and to define populism not only as a negative, dark side opposed to liberalism, but to take them seriously, which doesn't mean to accept what they say. Populists tend to appeal to the people against the elite and to the people as a group which is diverse. It's not like the Marxists who appealed to the working class. In order to make these people, which is quite diverse, unified, they address the emotional dimension of politics. I think this is the biggest interest of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, who are left-wing populists, political theorists. This is their main idea. Politics is also emotional. You have a rhetorical element, and they propose the embodiment by the charismatic leader to unify the people around the charismatic leader. They play the electoral game. They don't want to establish a dictatorship, but they don't embrace constitutionalism, and they can restrict the rule of law, the checks and powers, and so on. And for sure, the right-wing populists focus on ideological values that I explained previously, which are at odds with what the left-wing populists are defending. So, once you have this concept of populism in mind, what are the factors which explain this far-right populism in rising Europe? I think a huge dimension is the change at world level. Look at the falling share of world GDP in parity of purchase, what is PPP? Purchasing power parity. Yes, so you pay less for a meal in China than in the US, so you have to equate them. So there is a tendency, which is quite clear, of decline between 1980, 30% of the world GDP was in Europe, and now 15%. In 40 years, half of it. And it is very concrete. It means that now, if you want an electric car, well, the Chinese ones are much cheaper and better than the European ones. So the auto industry, which was central to European industry, especially in Germany, but not only in Germany, is in danger. And you could add a lot of things like this. And the difference with the US is mostly that the US are strong in services and less in industry, and this is the opposite in Europe. But the decline of our economic power is huge, which means that the welfare state in Europe, which was able to draw resources from the old world and with the global market exchanging high-quality products against low-quality products or raw materials, is in danger. We have more difficulties to redistribute wealth to our citizens. And this is especially true in parts of Europe which are not oriented towards the new economy. There is a strong political decline. This is the figure for the two main German political parties, the Christian Democrats in dark and the Social Democrats in red. Germany was the country in which the mass political parties were invented in the second half of the 19th century. And you see a decline which is very strong. Here it ends in 2012, but the decline is going on. And if you take the 50 more important political parties in Europe, the tendency is the same, more or less, but the global tendency is the same, which means that the mass political parties, which used to represent a channel of communication between the people and the elite, has disappeared. And the gap between the citizenry and the elite is growing at political level. There is also, and this is very important, since a couple of years, a backlash against the green transition. The green transition was top priority in Europe during the last mandate of von der Leyen, the EU president. It was really the top priority with very ambitious goals. And now, because of a backlash, because it was not conceived as a just transition, which means that those who are the poorest people will have a much more important load for this transition, and they refuse it. And since 2 years, 1.5 years, there is a strong deconstruction of the green transition. We will much probably don't respect our goals which were defined in the international agreements. So Trump is more radical, but the tendency is not that different in Europe. There is a backlash against the gender revolution. I think that if you look at the history of humanity, the gender revolution in the last 50 years has been one of the most important revolutions in the history of mankind. I mean, the fact that you have as many women as men in such an audience is one a sign of it. What the Americans call the reproductive rights, which were recognized previously in the socialist countries, but which were recognized in the 70s also in the West. This is a huge evolution in the West, and there is a backlash from part of the people against it, especially against the most radical expression of it. The transsexual guys are, and women are the object of a backlash. The EU has specific problems. We have a stronger welfare state, but it is under threat with growing inequalities. We have a very weak federation. If you compare in Europe the number of civil servants at EU, for the EU specifically, it's 33,000. If you compare it with more than 2 million civil servants for the federal government in the US and a number of millions of civil servants in China, you can understand that the center is very weak in Europe. The center can make decisions as a normative power, but has no implementation or financial power. And there is an increasing division and polarization. Another problem is the very low level of the political class. After World War II, we had political leaders who had experienced historical events. In the 60s and 70s, there were huge social movements, and these leaders experienced also a period of turmoil and so on, like the Cultural Revolution in China. But now we have politicians who are only professional politicians, who have degrees, but who are small politicians. They have no vision of history. They just calculate for the short term, for the next election, for the polls. And this is a real problem. Another problem in Europe is that multiculturalism works well when you have migrants which are white and which come from Christian countries, but it is perceived as a danger with migrants coming from the global south and especially with Muslims. We have to note that most often the places where the far right is the strongest are the places where you have less migrants. The places where you have a lot of migrants, like in the city where I live, in Saint-Denis, north from Paris, you have migrants and people can be a bit racist or xenophobic, but they know the people. But in the small villages, for example, where my mother lives, then a lot of people, there are no migrants, but they are against migrants, and especially against Muslims and black migrants. We have a problem with our foreign policy, and especially since the war in Ukraine and the war in the Middle East, the double standard of the West in general and Europe in particular is no more credible in the South. So it's much more difficult for Europe to be a world leader at international level. And, well, there was a war in Ukraine. We had a model based on low-cost energy, basically the Russian gas. It is over, and we have an obsession in the political class and media about a potential war from Russia against Europe. It's really, wow, it's incredible. It's a paranoia. People think that in a couple of years, Russian tanks could be in Berlin or Paris. Again, what Trump's government is making for Europe is very difficult. Very difficult. We were a minor ally of the US, and now we don't know really what to do. We have Russia, which is seen as a danger. There is no European army. There are 27 European armies. It was somehow united due to the NATO, but without the US, the NATO is no more a power. And so the fact that Europe has to find its own way, or should find it, is a real challenge. So, to summarize and to conclude, increasingly in most European countries, a bit less in the north, a bit more in the south and the east, the elected governments are seen as governments of the elite by the elite for the elite. They are elected, but you have the choice between the bad and the very bad very often. So there is an appeal to the people against the domination by this political elite, and sometimes by the economical elite. There is a widespread distrust against neoliberal globalization. During decades, globalization was in favor of Europe, and now it is perceived as bad for Europe by the people, not by the elite. And so you have some kind of dystopic imaginary, which is based on real experience. Europe now is a province of the world, is no more at the center of the world. The national states in Europe are small states. Alone they can do a lot of things, but they have difficulties to unite in a strong federal European model. Electoral democracy functions at state level, not at international level, and even EU elections for the parliament are an addition of national elections. It's not a transnational elections. The European social model, which I think is very good, is under threat. There are challenges for the gender, for the green transition, and to some extent what are doing the right-wing populists is to address to these emotions, to the political unconscious of the people. They are saying it's going badly and our elite are unable to fix the problem. Something very similar to what Trump said in the US. So, what is the future? I think that in Europe, now the far-right populism is a nostalgic force. It is not an alternative modernity. There are some elements of it, but a few elements of it, and they propose short-term policies, which won't solve most European challenges. the most probable scenario, it's not sure, but I would say 70%, will be an increasing alliance between a radicalized traditional right and the far right. So we will see Europe moving increasingly to the right. And because they have no solutions for the future, I think that the European decline will probably deepen in the next decade. Another thing is that the subaltern groups, to quote an expression from Antonio Gramsci, are very far from institutional politics in Europe. The official politics seems reduced to small political games by a political elite which doesn't care for the people. And this is an opening for the far right, which was not in the power, and is one which says, well, we could fix the problems. I do not think that denouncing far-right nationalist populists is sufficient. Very often the political elite, both in the academy and in politics and in the media in Europe, say these are bad guys. It is true, but it's not enough. And I think that democracy and the social and economic system in Europe has to be changed quite a lot to be able to answer the challenges of this century. When you compare Europe in the 19th century and in the 20th century, after the World War II, you had huge differences. You had the welfare state, you have the universal suffrage, you have a unification which began in Europe. And I think that Europe should do something similar in size, in importance. And unfortunately, I don't see this. And I must confess that I am, as a person, a very optimistic person, but I was never so pessimistic than in the last year. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Yves, for this very comprehensive and decisive talk. So we now let's invite Professor Chizia to give a comment.
So it's my thank you for Dominic for inviting me to come to Beijing University. So I'm from Tsinghua University, even though we are very close, but it's not very often for people from Tsinghua to come here. So I think I thank you for this invitation, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be a discussant of my old friend, Professor Sintomer. And but before I go into the substance, I'd like to say a word about democracy 3.0. And but Professor Sintomer today didn't talk about democracy 3.0, but he will talk about it in Tsinghua University the day after tomorrow, also 3 p.m. at the School of Public Policy and Management in Tsinghua University, exact same time. And right, so I hope if you are interested, you will come to Tsinghua University as well. Yeah. Okay. So first, I'm very impressed by. I learned a lot from Professor Sintomer's overview, like a panorama of the so-called far right, and I'm struck by many examples because I read some news, but I think your presentation is the most comprehensive I have listened so far on this topic. And but many examples seems to have this common pattern that political alliance are and the ideological alliance are very much cross-cutting, and it's very difficult to derive a political position from the social position. For example, your example of Brazil. So in the urban area of Brazil, right, far right has more supports. But in the rural area of United States, far right has more support. I think it's a very telling example, showing that it's very difficult to, from social position, to derive at political position. And this, since in China we are very much influenced by traditional Marxist social analysis, we tend to ask which party represent which social class interest, right? This is a very common pattern, common way of thinking in China, but also quite generally, I think in the West too, the theory of Max Weber and all the major Western sociologists tend to presuppose, they tend to think political coalition presuppose existing social coalitions or social class patterns. But I think Professor Sintomer gave us this example very telling. Because another example is that I noticed, because you mentioned far-right international, and I'm sure you know that there is so recently, I think founded in 2018, the so-called Progressive International, I think jointly initiated by former Greek Minister of Finance Yanis Varoufakis and United States Senator, this most famous guy for democratic socialism, Sanders. The two of them are the main initiators of this Progressive International, and but interestingly, I think another example of this cross-cutting of the traditional left and the right position is that Varoufakis recently very strongly against the French court banning this Le Pen, banning this female right-wing French politician who currently lead in the pool to become the next president in the 2027 of France. But the court in France banned her for supposedly violation some kind of minor crimes, like her party has both representation in the European Parliament, but also has domestic representation. And for the aid, the political aids, the 助理的钱, so this support aids for European Parliament party and domestic party, they mix up. And but they say many other parties mix it up too. Not only her party misuse or combine this use, which is not supposed to. But anyway, but not only the right-wing people, like including the Trump, oppose this ban of Le Pen, but Varoufakis very strongly against. He thinks the left should work to defeat her politically, but not through this legal means. And so I think this is an example of this cross-cutting. So I think maybe my most fundamental question is that whether or not we should call it far-right populism, or because another possibility, I'm having to think through about this, but another possibility is just to, like Lenin used to say, proletarian internationalism and renegade Kautsky. But because we can just say the traditional left betrayed left ideal, and so become the right wing in some sense, in some dimensions, like Thomas Piketty talks about many Western intellectuals and Social Democratic Party become what he called the 婆罗门左派, the Brahmin left, this highest class in India. But the Thomas Piketty believed the left, many more left become Brahmin 婆罗门左派。So in another way is to say, maybe we shouldn't call this traditional left party the left, but another thing is that we shouldn't call it the far right. Probably, but anyway, so this may be just the terminological, but maybe reflects something because I'm thinking when you talk about we need a neutral definition of populism, right? This is very important because it reminds me the very notion of populism first originated in the late 19th century in Russia, right?
America.
And America, yes. This populist movement against chivalry standard in U.S., the rural area, right? So this 俄国民粹主义在19世纪末 was considered very progressive. It's a forerunner of the Lenin, right? The socialist revolution in Russia begin with the Russian 民粹派. So anyway, the Russian. So the other word is. So I think this is general point. General point I'm trying to conclude is that because like maybe another example I think Yongle may touch upon this legal the democracy and the constitutionalism. So right now in the U.S. Among the legal scholars, most permanent supporter of Trump legally is Harvard Law School professor Andrew Vermeulen. And you know him, right? Andrew Vermeulen. But Andrew Vermeulen used to write books together with Cass Sunstein. So Cass Sunstein is definitely, he was Obama's like top guy in information technology, and Obama is definitely democratic. For Democratic Party, but he co-authored with Andrew Vermeulen. But Andrew Vermeulen now uses legal theory to justify basically against lower-level court ruling against Trump executive order, saying that this violated the separation of power, and the low court judge has no right to overrule democratically elected Trump's executive order. But anyway, I'm not trying to, actually, myself have not reached a definite conclusion, but I just use this as an example to show that since Vermeulen and Cass Sunstein work closely together, used to be, I guess maybe now they don't speak to each other, maybe not, I don't know. But the point is that this kind of traditional divide of left and right seems to be more and more illusionary, and my like my friend also had the Harvard Law School, Roberto Unger, who is a leader of critical legal studies in the U.S., but also he worked for 2 terms for President Lula in Brazil as a minister of strategic affairs. And so Unger's whole social theory is try to argue against. Basically, he argues that political coalition does not presuppose social coalition. Rather, the political project, with the aim of creating new social coalition. That's the aim of political project, and which depends on the policy innovations. So all the parties, in a way, it's not like traditional Marxists or Max Weber to represent a certain given social interest, but rather through policy innovations to create a new political space and how should I say so this is maybe what the European traditional left is lacking. No, it's not lacking in terms of proposing new political policies to, because in another maybe more simple way to put it is that all political parties are what some political science literature called catch-all parties. Catch-all party. They are not represent a single social interest, but it's a catch-all party. They try to be catch-all party, but certainly not possible. But through their policy design innovations, they try to be a cultural, like Communist Party in China used to call the representative of working class in China. But since Jiang Zemin changed the party charter, saying that the Chinese Communist Party is both the representation of working class in China, but also the representation of the whole Chinese people. Okay, thank you so much.
To respond now? I mean, there were a lot of questions, so I will choose three of them. The first one is about this cross-cutting alliances between different classes, different ideologies, catch-all parties. Well, to some extent, I would be more Marxist than you. At least, I would say that we have to have a constructivist version of the classes and of the relation between classes and political parties. It is still the case that in most European countries, you have strong relations between classes and parties, but it's not always the same. Namely that in one country, you could, or even in one, take Belgium, the working class in the French-speaking part of Belgium votes for a former Maoist party, and in the Flemish part, in Leuven, for a far-right populist party. So it means that you have class constituencies, but they change. So it's not that you have a class and then you have a party which represents the class, but it is a moving panorama with still a lot of correlations. What, for example, works less is the gender divide, which used to be very strong in most European countries. And now, for example, in France, all things equal, women and men vote the same for the far right and for the left. It's not exactly the case in Germany, but it doesn't make a big difference. The second thing is that about the constitutional dimension. I should have said this, but there is a strong difference between the US Constitution and most European constitutions, which is that the US Constitution is outdated. It's an old constitution, which is quite nearly impossible to change. So the change comes only from the Supreme Court interpretation of the Constitution. In most European countries, you can change the Constitution relatively easily, and you have changes very often. So the relation with the Constitution is different. This said, you also have increasingly in Europe a tendency of what has been called the lawfare, to use the law as a political instrument against adversaries. This has been the case in Romania, where elections were cancelled due to a so-called Russian influence in the elections, because the far-right leader would have been elected. And in France, for something which was illegal, but not that important, the principal leader of the far-right, Marine Le Pen, has been declared non-eligible. This could change, but it's an example of the lawfare. And the last thing I would like to say, it's quite clear that the old social democracy, the old left, has become a party of the elite. A bit like in the US, Democrats are the party of the intellectual and partly economic elite. This has been also the case in Europe, but one has to say that the radical left has been unable to fill the void. Here you see that the left at European level has made less than 8% of the vote. So it means that the far right has been able to occupy the void but not not the radical left. And the radical left is very divided. Is also very often looking backward to the marvelous period when Europe was at the center of the world, had a strong welfare state, and there is no clear alternative against the far-right populism. The left-wing populism is weaker now than it used to be 10 years or 7 years ago. This said, in most European countries, you still have a left-wing divide. The political, you can have divisions within the right, within the left, within the far right, within the radical left, within the center, but still, all attempts to go beyond the left-wing, right-wing divide have failed up to now. And the scenario is more an island between the right and the far right, which still is a line in this left-right divide.
I was deeply impressed by Professor Sintomer's talk. I think this is a very comprehensive review of the current situation of populism in Europe. I have a few comments. The first comment is that when we talk about populism, we are actually talking about, the current the current situation of the liberal democracy with welfare state, this mainstream model in Europe. But I wonder whether today, its challenge is basically, in a way to the true situation of this liberal democracy has been demonstrated. Because traditionally, my observation is that this mainstream model was based upon two important pillars. One is the U.S. protection, because historically, with the NATO, U.S. can use this military to protect Europe, so Europe can cut off its military spending and put it into sort of welfare construction. So this is the first thing. The second thing is the so-called residual, I would call it, residual colonial profit, because a lot of European countries are used to be colonial empires. So when the colonies declare independence, but still, there's some kind of benefit they enjoyed from these colonies. France, as an example, in Middle Africa or Western Africa, France even controlled the currency for many years. So many years. So today we have seen that the two pillars are now in danger because the U.S. threatened that it will no longer offer free protection. In other words, this kind of service should be charged. The second thing is that with the change of the current landscape, economic landscape, with the rise of the global south, this kind of residual colonial profit is now declining. So then, fiscally, this is obviously, I think fiscally, this means that the European states, they fiscally don't have much money at their hand to maintain their current, the traditional, the mainstream model. So I wonder whether the current situation of this liberal democracy, has a lot with it, the shaking of these two important pillars. And the second point I would like to make is about the Chinese perspective of a lot of European so-called populist politician and the statesman. We are now living in an interesting age in which a lot of traditional terms are being reshuffled. right wing and left wing, but also developing and developed it. So according to our traditional understanding, Europe belonged to so-called developed countries, and China belonged to developing countries. So this means we have very different agendas, politically and economically. But today, when we look at a lot of European countries, we can see that a lot of them, they are pursuing a kind of strategy of developmental state strategy. So for us, this is quite familiar because we have this a period of time in which we put economy development in the center. 以经济建设为中心 centered on economic development. But now, if we look at a lot of European countries, we can see that a lot of politicians seem to have some kind of consciousness that they economically, because the country is meeting some kind of difficulty, so they would try to rearrange the whole policy in order to make it to push development forward. So this including the ecological policy. So if you look at these countries, we can see that position are close to a lot of countries in Global South. Because in Global South, many countries said that they have this notion that, if we want a development, then we should have cheap energy. Then Europeans should have shoulder its historical responsibility and give more subsidies to the Global South. But now, a lot of European countries now switch to that direction. And we are also in the process of development. So this is why we cannot shoulder the responsibility as a developed country. So I think this is very interesting. This kind of self-consciousness has been totally changed, developed and developing. Like interestingly, if you look at even Donald Trump, when we look at Donald Trump, I remember for quite a few times, he just mentioned that, we U.S. are a third world country. Because we have very bad infrastructure. We terribly need money to build up these infrastructures. So this is why we cannot afford this kind of ecological subsidies. And then, interestingly, on the other hand, if you look at China, well, now China becomes a kind of leader in this ecological revolution, because we have very advanced green energy, and China tried to export this energy to a lot of Global South countries. So this could make this ecological innovation sustainable in the Global South, because there is a center for those technologies. So I really wonder. This is my second question about the terminology of developing and developed. This self-consciousness of as a developed country may have been shaken to a certain kind of stand. And the third question about you, in your description about those social groups, you mentioned a very important group, which is like Uber workers. And you tell us that most of them are now pretty much pro right wing. So I really wonder whether there's more detailed analysis of this social group, and whether there's any political party on the left wing successfully mobilized this group in order to support themselves. Political mobilization and political representation are very important. If they are not represented by the left-wing party, then the right-wing party may get them. So I wonder, this social group, what's the political potential of this social group? Because with the development of new technology, we have seen this platform capitalism. In Europe, in the US, in China, we have a lot of those kind of platform firms, and in which those workers doesn't establish very traditional relations of employment with those platforms. And this is a very fragmented situation. And for the traditional labor law, family law, it's hard for those traditional law to deal with this situation. I think China is also very struggling to tackle with these questions. So with this expanding platform economy, so I do think that this group is politically more and more important. So their political potential, I think, do need some kind of further analysis. And my last question is about, because you talk about the shaking of this liberal democracy model, and on the rising of this right-wing populism. But I wonder, what's the current situation of the right-wing party? As you just mentioned, that Social Democratic Party in Europe have become very elitist parties. But is there no hope at all? Is there any possibility, political potential you have seen in different countries toward what you just talk about as democracy 3.0? So I have those 4 questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Again, very important and difficult questions. I completely agree that the change, the huge change in the global situation of the world is a crucial factor, which is neglected by Europeans because we don't think about ourselves as those who have had this residual colonial profit. We were for democracy, human rights, and so on. There was no negative side. And the US protection, I also do agree. But we have to add that in a world where global capitalism is so strong, in order to tame this capitalism, you have to have a strong state. And the problem is that the national European states are too small to be strong. If you put, for example, too much taxes on capital, they will leave. Yeah. And at EU level, we are too weak and too divided to impose a taming of capitalism. So what national states have done in Europe after World War II, taming capitalism and ensuring the welfare state, is very difficult now for Europe. I think it's easier for China because of the size of the country and the political system. It's even easier in the US because of the size of the country and the economy. In Europe, it's very difficult. So it means that it's difficult to compensate the loss of power in the world. And this is a very difficult factor. To give you one example, my wife is working in an ecological NGO in Brussels, a lobby in Brussels for the green transition. And since 2 years, it's terrible. But when you look at those who give money to these NGOs, you have NGOs like Oxfam or Greenpeace who have a lot of members all over the world, so small donors. But most of the lobbies in Brussels are getting the money from big donors. And these big donors are as much Americans as Europeans. So it means that their values, interests, perspectives is very strongly influencing the Brussels bubble and the discussions in Brussels. So the problem is not the Russian influence. The problem is the US influence in Brussels. The second question, yes, for sure. I mean, the differences between developing and developed countries is changing. I know I have problems to put China in the global south, to be frank. I said the South plural, but what parallel can you make between Congo and China? Come on, you are more near to Europe than to Congo, and And it's true that very often when I come to China, and this has been one of the most existential and intellectual experiences in my life, to get to know China. I mean, we are becoming, as a developing country, in respect to China, the most intelligent economic elites now in Europe say, well, we have to do the same that China did 3 decades ago. We have to tell the Chinese companies, invest in Europe, share your technology, take some interests, but not everything, and give us some advanced technology. So, and just an anecdote, but 10 years ago or 13 years ago, I gave a lecture in a small NGO here in Beijing, and doctoral students who accompanied me to the subway, we were discussing about the subways, and I asked them, did you visit Paris? Oh, yes. And how did you feel? Great. But the subway in Paris is dirty, it doesn't function well. And I thought, well, they're all right. It's true. Compared to the Beijing subway, we are backward. And I think that this feeling of the most advanced is no more in Europe. It's wow. And although ordinary people don't know it, because they don't visit China, but they feel it because if they want to buy a cheap electric car, it's a Chinese one. It's not a French or German or Italian one. So, this said, I don't think that the civilization crisis in Europe is at the same level as the one in the US. It's much worse in the US. And the decline of the life expectancy in the US is a sign of a civilization crisis which is incredible and which has no parallel in Europe until now, perhaps in 20 years, but at the time being, no. For the last question, the Uber workers, my attention on this was because of a discussion in the Brazilian left, and I had a meeting online with the former candidate of the left for the São Paulo city elections last year, and he said we lost the election because of the Uber workers, the capitalist platform workers. How can the left address these workers? They don't want to become wage workers because they want some liberty in defining their schedule. So the left has to propose more security for them, but not to think them as the future wage workers. And at the time being, I don't think that the left has a credible answer to this. And I think it should be crucial for the left, because of the development of this kind of capitalism, to find a narrative for these workers.
Thank you very much for this great discussion. So I will ask a very brief question to take the privilege of being the moderator, and then I will leave the floor open for questions and discussions. So I wonder, you have described various characteristics of the far right in Europe. Some are religious, some are not. Some are feminist, some are anti-feminism, so to speak, and some are anti-NATO, and some are pro-NATO. So there are, the political stances varies quite a lot in this regard. But I think at least one thing stands out. All they have one thing in common, that they are anti-immigrant.
Mm-hmm.
Is it fair to to say this, right? So they see these kind of outsiders, immigrants or foreigners as somehow a kind of a threat. It's fair to say that they share, all the, even the far right in the United States or in Latin America, they share to some extent this kind of penchant, so to speak. And how do you understand this? I mean, can you explain a bit further? We can perhaps approach this from a kind of a liberal democratic view, as you mentioned. I share your understanding that the mainstream understanding of populism in the West is not sufficient in understanding all this, because they tend to blame this kind of a tendency on some kind of irrationality, right? So these guys are irrational. But this does not seem to be sufficient, because people do have this kind of pain on themselves, and but unfortunately they try to blame the outsiders. A lot of the supporters of the far right are actually working class people, right? They are disadvantaged in their own society, but instead of working, in order to advance the interest of the working class, tend to blame outsiders. It seems the easy thing to do, but it's a curious phenomenon. As you mentioned, a different approach to this might be from more of a leftist perspective view. To see this phenomena as essentially kind of, I don't know, maybe to see this as a failure, as a long years of control by a certain kind of a new liberal agenda, and the working class are unable to organize themselves into a significant political campaign or party. And also, if you look at the current situation, it seems that even the far right political powers, they're not entirely capitalistic. Mm-hmm. They claim, to represent the working class, but sometimes they are even more capitalistic than the so-called, the democratic socialists. The democratic socialists are elitists. They kind of turn their back upon the working class. But the far right, they claim to represent the working class, but they don't really. Essentially, they represent the capitalistic forces like Donald Trump. Right? We're working with the hyper-capitalists like Elon Musk. And in Europe, I'm not sure, but it seems like more or less the same. There's no significant campaign really from the working class, from the left, going on, and it's really a curious phenomenon going on right now, and it seems that it's going to continue for quite a long time. How so? I mean, why we come to this kind of a point? It seems obvious that we really need to kind of organize the working class and try to improve ourselves, including development programs. But it seems that the answer is there, but nobody is able to achieve that, to get to this kind of a point. So how do you explain this kind of a phenomenon?
Well, actually, it's a crucial question, and I don't have an answer to this. I think that probably the answer should be found in social psychology. Something, for example, that the non-orthodox Marxist so-called Frankfurt School did after World War II, the work on authoritarian personality. Norbert Elias, a German sociologist who worked during a very long period in England, wrote a book on the outsiders. I don't remember the title, but it is The Outsiders, something like this. He described a small city in England where you have two groups of people who have the same working class status, but you have some who lived there, the families lived there from centuries, and the other went to this small town when London was bombed by Germany during the war. And there was a huge prejudice against the outsiders. There is something like this which is going on. I also think that in a period when there is a huge existential uncertainty about the present state of Europe, there is no more the feeling that the progress will allow us to integrate new people. You have this, but it's striking in the small villages, and in Europe a small village, it is 300 people. Around where my mother lived, you have 40% of the people who vote for the far right. There is no migrant there. So it's an imagination, an imaginary of France will be, French people will be replaced by people coming from the south. And there is some rational element, which is that all the research shows that migration is good for the economy altogether, but it could be difficult for the lower class because there is competition between migrants and the most lowest level of the European working class. So based on this, you have something. But I think that the explanation is socio-psychological, and I don't have enough knowledge on this to answer. But it's clearly a huge factor.
Can I add one observation? Because I noticed that a lot of right-wing politicians do have different attitudes towards different groups of immigrants. For example, from if the immigrants are from Ukraine, then they may be very supportive. But if it's from Africa, then it's quite different. So in other words, they are not all of them. They are against the immigration. It really depends on which race. I would say, this maybe some kind of racism or the civilization.
Sure. If you are white, it's easier. If you are Christian, it's easier. For sure. And if you are non-white and non-Christian, but you accept to work for nothing in the fields to get the potatoes and tomatoes and so on, and you just don't say anything, that's fine. But if you want to become to send your kids to the school, to become a politician, to become an entrepreneur, this is another story.
Point about the Global South, China and Global South. In China, we usually consider ourselves part of the Global South group. It's not exactly a geographical term, in my understanding. So it has to do with this kind of a colonialist experience to begin with, I think, because all the previously colonized countries or partially colonized countries, they share this kind of experience. The West is dominant power, and we are kind of subaltern. And currently, in recent decades, also you see this kind of a Western alliances, these groups, these are kind of a G7, NATO, all these kind of alliances. and some countries are excluded, right? So this kind of experience of this being excluded and being included in some groups also have factors in the kind of exception of the notion of Global South, I think. Yeah.
No, I do agree, and I think it's really one of the most positive evolution at the time being, that the balance of power in the world is changing, and this is good, But come on, China will be the next imperialist state, and in 20 years you will speak of the global I don't know what, because China will have, not militarily, but economically colonized the rest of the world.
So we open the floor for further questions.
Hi, Professor. Good afternoon. My name is Laurent, if you prefer my French name. I have actually two questions. First of all, I love the topology you mentioned in your presentation, but I'm just curious about the role of communism plays in your topology, and how this topology would diverse or, be in the same place with their attitudes towards China. That's my first question. Just to add another matrix, if you like, into your topology. That's what I'm interested in. And the second question is, I don't know whether you agree, but for me, I think the Russia-Ukraine war is just a suppressed Third World War for me. It's suppressed thanks to the legacy of World War II, but the impact it cast on global order, I think that's almost on the same level. And I don't know whether you agree, but I think that's really nudged or pushed Europeans or even Chinese or Russian, even in general, I think the world to think more critically about their role in the world. So if we can agree on that, I'm just curious what European... I love the point you mentioned that, the 20th century, Europe had, over the 20th century, Europe has changed a lot. But like how Europe would take this opportunity to be the writer of the role in 21st century. Because like the global world order after World War II, it was most written by Chinese, US, England in general, or Soviet Union plus that. But like how Europe would take the opportunity to shape global order, to even prepare for the World War IV. Yeah, that's my questions. To even prepare for the World War IV. Yeah, that's my questions.
Communism in Europe is now inexistent. The communist parties which remain are very small. It's difficult to call them communists. For some of them, the French Communist Party, for example, has nothing to do with what it used to be. And China, ordinary people don't know China, listen only to the news, and in the news, it's only the negative sides are known, which are not necessarily false, but it's so one-sided that a global understanding of China is impossible. At elite level, China is considered as a danger, but not that much a military, but an economic danger. But now with Trump, some part of the elite thinks that we have to rebalance and make alliances with China and India and Brazil in order to... But it's a very primitive discussion on China, both in the elites and among citizens, I guess. For the Russian war, it's quite difficult for Europe. I don't think it's comparable to World War II, because World War II was much more a catastrophe, and at international level was really a world war. I think that this is more a provincial war with international repercussions, but it's more regional in the east of Europe. And I don't think that Russia will invade the EU. I mean, Russia failed to conquer Ukraine, which is 10 times less economically powerful than Russia. I don't think that Putin is so stupid to make an invasion of Europe, which is 10 times more economically powerful than Russia. Although the military in Russia is very strong, but in the middle term he would lose. He has lost to a large extent the war in Ukraine. But there is a paranoia in Europe on this. I mean, we have in the news the leaders, official leaders, who tell us you have to prepare for 3 days if the war is coming. And there is, it's incredible. So I think that the changes will be different. And to go back to what you asked me and I didn't answer, at the time being in Europe, I don't see the alternative. We have democratic innovations which are developing, but the far right is developing much more intensively and quickly. Perhaps we don't have something like the Democrat socialists, like Sanders and Octavio Cortez in the US. We have small parties. I mean, the former Greek finance minister has a party which is, it's peanuts. But history is full of surprises.
If I may respond, I agree that Russia-Ukraine war is not World War III, but I still stand by. Maybe I will step back. I would say semi-World War II, World War III repressed by the World War II order, and at the same time, just again talking about the change would happen in Europe in 21st century, because the stance for Europe has changed. In the past, it's like more like a leader role on the international stage. But now we have to admit that, like China, Europe is more in a responsive way. It's just like Trump would sign a deal and it will cast tariffs on approximately worldwide. But now it's just like we have to be responsive because they are the strongest. They have the first-hand advantage, and so it's just I don't know, but I'm thinking about this idea about a reinvention of Eurocentric for Europeans, or even Euro-Asia centric, something like that. I don't know. It's just a very preliminary thought in my mind, but I'm just curious about your thoughts about it.
Could you repeat the end of your question, because I'm not sure I understood well.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, kind of chaotically thinking about the reinvention of Eurocentric, but definitely in different contexts. Not the old narrative, but I'm just in a broader way, Asia, Euro-Asia centric, something like that. I don't exactly know, in a sense, what I'm talking about, but just curious about your thoughts.
Again, I think that, for example, for the change of the world order, the growth of China and India are more important than the Ukraine war. It's difficult for Europe for geopolitical reasons, quite difficult. But in the end of the day, I don't think this is a main factor, except perhaps for the cost of the energy. And then the problem is that when you speak about the West in China, most people think about the US. And and in Europe, people don't know China, nor India. So it's difficult to think to an alliance or a reshaping, a Euro-Asian reshaping of the world order. I guess that, for example, the academic exchanges are very important. And a friend of mine who was coming back from a stay in the US at NYU in New York told me, in New York, at the time being, everybody tells me that the future is Chinese. But if China wants to gain the hegemony, they should transform their universities like the universities in the West, very open to international students and so on and so forth. This would add a soft power dimension to the economic strength of the country. And vice versa, we have much less Chinese students in European universities than those who go to the UK, Australia, or used to go to the US. Now it's declining. So I think that these exchanges are very important to try to imagine another order.
Thanks for your answer and even indulging me.
Hi, Professor. My question is not related to politics, but much more related to the function of academia as a whole in response to the far right. So I've noticed that recently in the kind of the U.S. academia, particularly, several keywords like activism, diversity, or as you've mentioned, trans, they have always been like sensitive keywords that are already on the border of being censored. So, like, as individual researchers, how are, like, people that used to take the stance, like, on the left side, now respond to this type of paradigmic transformation as researchers or as academia as a whole? Yeah.
In Europe, you mean?
Everywhere.
Well, I guess the situation is quite different in the US because the offensive against the academy is much bigger. But also because the elite universities in the US are more far away from the citizenry compared to Europe, where public universities either don't cost anything or cost only not that much. So it's another relation between the academy and the university, the global citizenry. This said, there is a new dimension which was absent before, which is really a strong censorship or pressure, at least, against two things. First, on Muslims and the defense of a multicultural society. And second, on the Palestine-Israeli conflict. It's really difficult. For example, I was, until recently, part of the president's board of my university, and the president, it was 4 months ago, received on Saturday evening at 10, it's not WeChat in France, but the same, from the Ministry of Higher Education, saying you don't do anything against anti-Semitism. We want you to come and discuss this next Wednesday in the French Ministry of Higher Education. And there is nothing, but it's a pressure for censorship, so that you would have much difficulty to organize something. And I organized a conference on the Israelo-Palestine conflict last year. I was very careful to invite Jewish people who were anti-Zionists, but so that I can't be accused of anti-Semitism, because the majority of the persons were Jews. But we had to do it behind closed doors, because it was too dangerous we could have provocations, and then the university would be accused, for example, because in France we have a radical Jewish student union, and if some activists come and make a mess and we say, get out, then we will be accused of anti-Semitism. So I have never seen this in my life. This is very strong, very strong.
Related question maybe, the current administration in Israel is also far right.
Oh yes,
Yeah, right?
it's perhaps fascist, the most fascist. No, but seriously, it's not only apartheid. It's mob violence, military violence.
It seems that mainstream, both left and right in Europe, stand with the Israeli government. Does that make them more, kind of a pro-far right?
Yeah, and I mean, Europe, it was in Europe that the Holocaust took place. The Jewish question was solved, making the Jews a settler colony on not in Europe, but in the Middle East. And then it's a mess, and we still say that this is part of the free world, and it's terrible.
Okay, maybe last question. Yeah.
It's a shame.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your lecture and super clear breakdown of the composition of the far right in Europe right now. It's actually making me quite nostalgic because I studied European studies 10 years ago. So that's like right before Brexit and right before Donald Trump, and there are like very familiar terms from that time. Marine Le Pen was there, and AFD was there. So all these very familiar terms. So I'm curious if what you've been talking about, what happened in the past decade, was part of sort of a much bigger and longer trend originated from maybe 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago. As in, I guess 10 years ago when we were talking about sort of challenges posed by the immigrants, the border was Turkey, and there was refugees and immigrants from, or kind of I would say victims of the ISIS and all that. And then the border of immigrants was moved sort of into to Ukraine now and later on. But then if we trace much earlier into the history, it was actually the guest workers in the 60s, 70s who moved from the former colonies to their master countries. So in that sense, if we can see this process of the rise of right-wing populism and all that as part of sort of the legacy, or the colonial legacy, or the collapse of colonial legacy, just I guess one, if what happened in the past decade can be seen a part of a longer history or historical trend. And two, if we compare, as how you began the lecture, we compare the differences of far right populism in Europe and the U.S. If we see, or if you see them as sort of one, I guess, reaction towards one reactionary movement against, say, neoliberalism, globalization since the 80s, 90s, that happened in 2 places, taking different patterns, or if you see these are 2 separate movements happening in different places, but just simultaneously and sort of merging or influencing each other. Thank you.
You mean globalization and migration?
Oh, I mean...
or Europe and the US?
Far right populism in Europe and the US. Are they 2 separate movements, or one movement taking different patterns in different places?
So for your first question, I'm convinced that this is a longer trend, but it's much quicker now. It's incredible. I mean, frankly, speaking with other political scientists or sociologists or scholars, nobody in my circles, not only in France but also in Germany, in Italy, would have bet that it would be so quick and so rude, I mean, in Europe and in the US. So history is not always developing at the same pace, and now it's running. And then I think that partly, and I've tried to give nuances, partly it's the same phenomena in the US and Europe, and partly it's different. Perhaps my hope and my nuanced judgment, say, is that in Europe we don't have neither the growing Christian fundamentalists that are developing in the US and in Latin America, this evangelist movement is really terrible. We don't have this in Europe. So we have right-wing Catholics, but it's a shrinking, even in countries like Poland or Italy, it's a shrinking minority. So this is good. And we don't have, at least yet, this very important portion of the people who are working for the security and the military, which are the basis for fascism in history. And we don't have this. I mean, Bolsonaro in Brazil could plan a coup which would have killed the president-elect, the vice president-elect, the strongest person in the Supreme Court. No European far-right can have this. Trump could have wanted to appeal to the military if his vice president had refused to accept Biden's victory. In Europe, it's very well. In Western Europe, at least, it's very difficult. You can do this in Romania because it's like a neo-colonial power, but in France, Italy, Germany, it's very difficult. So without the military and the security forces, and without the evangelists, then the social basis of the far right is weaker, and ideological counter tendencies could develop. At least I hope so.
Okay. I think it's about time. So thank you very much, Professor Sintomer, for this very comprehensive talk and discussion, and also thanks a lot for Professor Zhang and Professor Cui for this discussion. And thank you. Yeah, and also to maybe one word to conclude. I think indeed now we are entering a very interesting but also dangerous age. I remember in 2018 we organized an international conference on right-wing populism in Europe. At that time, right-wing populism in Europe is emerging, but it's not that obvious, right? But now, 6-7 years later, it's quite obvious. Nobody can deny. There's a strong surge of right-wing populism, not only in Europe but also across the world, across the West. And indeed, I think this is a hugely important phenomenon. And you can interpret right-wing populism in different ways, but I think I think the emotion that it sends out, the signal that sends out, that fear is a kind of emotion there. Fear of outsiders, fear of being left out, or fear of the global south or China. But fear is kind of a key word there, and I think to disappear this kind of fear, I think is crucial for people to communicate with, to know each other better. I think this is a fundamental reason that we have Professor Sintomer here, who traveled for thousands of miles to give us this talk and to get to a better understanding of each other. And I think this kind of communication, well, at least it won't probably solve the problem, but it will definitely contribute to the alleviation of the kind of a problem that we face as members of the common global community. So thank you very much, and we hope this kind